The Rabbit in the Garden, a true infidelity story. Word count 1200. Henry Lawson's mornings began with the soft grind of a coffee grinder and the low creak of aging wood beneath his slippers. At 67, he moved like someone who understood the weight of time, not with resentment, but with resignation. His home, a quiet cottage on the edge of a sleepy Massachusetts town, was surrounded by a garden he had kept for over 3 decades. Each bloom had once held meaning, anniversaries, birthdays, reconciliations, but now they existed mostly for the bees. Margaret, his wife of 40 years, preferred the indoors. She read novels in their sunroom with a blanket folded precisely over her knees, glasses slipping down the bridge of her nose. Their conversations had shrunk over time to observations about the weather or passive remarks about who'd called from the church committee. "Your tulips are bending too much," she said one morning without looking up from her book. "They're leaning toward the light," Henry replied. Margaret hummed, a sound of vague acknowledgement or dismissal. He could never tell which anymore. They loved each other, or at least remembered how to. But there was a growing silence between them, the kind that doesn't beg to be filled. It merely stretches day by day until even breathing in the same room feels like noise. One afternoon, as Henry knelt to trim the overgrown ivy near the fence, Margaret stood by the porch and said, "You should think about hiring someone. Your knees aren't what they used to be." "I'm fine." She glanced at his sweat-dampened collar. "It's not weakness. Just age." Henry looked up at her. "You say that like they're different things."
She didn't respond.
By the end of the week, Margaret had found someone. Sophie, 29, came recommended by a friend's niece who managed a local co-op. "Hardworking girl," Margaret said. "Keeps to herself." Henry expected a clumsy, overly chatty millennial with headphones and little interest in gardens. But Sophie arrived on a Wednesday morning in worn jeans and a green jacket, her dark hair tied into a low braid. She didn't talk much. She walked the garden slowly, crouched to inspect the soil, and touched the leaves like she was greeting old friends. Henry watched from the porch. "You've done this before." She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "My grandmother had a garden in Maine. I used to help her. It stuck."
They didn't say much else that first day.
Sophie worked steadily, pulling weeds with quiet concentration. When she left, Henry noticed the beds looked fresher. Not just cleaner, healthier, somehow. As if the garden had exhaled. Over the following weeks, Sophie returned every Tuesday and Friday. Their conversations grew incrementally, built not on small talk but shared rhythms. She asked questions about soil acidity, about the climbing roses he'd planted after his retirement. He told her stories about his years as a high school literature teacher, students who hated Shakespeare, the principal who once confused Walt Whitman with Walt Disney. Sophie laughed easily, but rarely smiled fully. There was always a sadness clinging to the corners of her mouth, like something left unsaid. One gray morning, Henry found her sitting on the edge of the stone bench near the hydrangeas, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She looked up at him, eyes rimmed red. "I'm sorry," she said, quickly wiping her face. "I just needed a second." He hesitated, then sat beside her, leaving a respectful gap. "Bad news." Sophie nodded. "Charles, my boyfriend. He does this thing where he disappears. Won't answer calls for days. Then shows up like nothing happened." Henry frowned. "That doesn't sound fair." "It's not. But I let it happen." She gave a half laugh. "You probably think I'm foolish." "No," he said quietly. "Just lonely." She looked at him, then really looked. "Yeah," she whispered. "Lonely." From that day, their conversations dipped into deeper waters. They talked about loneliness like old companions, his shaped by routine and silence, hers by emotional neglect and inconsistency. Henry began to notice little things, how Sophie hummed while pruning, how she tilted her head when lost in thought. She brought coffee in a thermos one morning, handing it to him with a shy glance. "It's the good kind," she said. "The kind you save for people you like." He smiled, then instantly felt a pang of guilt. Margaret noticed the shift before he did. One evening, As she set down her book, she asked, "Do you think she's pretty?" Henry blinked. "Who?" "That girl. Sophie." He hesitated too long. "She's young. I suppose that's always attractive." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "You talk about her a lot lately." "She's just good at what she does. The garden looks better." "It's not the garden I'm worried about." They didn't speak much after that. A week later, Sophie was pruning the rose arch when her finger slipped, cutting a thin line across her palm. Henry rushed to her side, taking her hand before she could protest. Their faces were close, too close. He wrapped the cut with his handkerchief, his fingers lingering just a second too long. She looked up at him with wide eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Their hands dropped, but something had already passed between them. That evening, Henry stood alone in the garden, watching the sun dip behind the maple trees. A rabbit darted across the path, pausing for just a moment before disappearing into the brush. He thought of Sophie's wounded hand, of Margaret's unreadable silence, of the letter he would one day write but never send. And as the last light faded, he realized the quiet was no longer peaceful, it was full of sound. And guilt. The days blurred into a familiar rhythm. Tuesdays and Fridays came and went with the soft scrape of a rake, the clipped hush of shears, and the low murmur of voices sharing the quiet labor of gardening. Henry told himself the connection was harmless, companionable, even wholesome. But something deeper had taken root, threading through his thoughts like ivy creeping up brick. He began waking earlier on the day Sophie was due to arrive, smoothing his hair more carefully, ironing the collar of his shirt though no one would notice beneath his cardigan. He loitered near the garden gate, pretending to inspect the hedges, waiting for the gravel crunch of her boots. She always arrived with purpose, work gloves in hand, hair coiled loosely at the nape of her neck. Her smile was brief but warm, like early spring sunlight. It shouldn't have meant so much. And yet, one Tuesday, the air held the heavy stillness of a storm in waiting. Thunderclouds loomed above the treeline, casting a moody silver across the garden. Sophie stood under the rose arbor, her jacket tied around her waist, sleeves rolled high. Her eyes lingered on the sky. "He's gone again," she said quietly. Henry looked up from the compost pile. "Charles?" She nodded. "Third time this month. Disappears. No call, no message. Then he comes back like nothing happened and acts like I'm the problem." There was no bitterness in her tone, just fatigue, worn at the edges. She reached for a pair of gloves, but her fingers trembled. "Do you love him?" Henry asked before he could stop himself. Sophie froze. "I used to. Or maybe I loved the idea of him. The way people love ghosts." Henry nodded, unsure what to say. "You know," she continued, "sometimes I think I stay because being half-loved is better than being completely alone." Henry's breath caught. He thought of Margaret, the chill in her eyes lately, the way she'd closed herself off like a book returned to a shelf. He hadn't touched her in months. Not in tenderness, not in desire. They had become cohabitants of memory. "You ever feel invisible?" Sophie asked, glancing at him. "All the time," Henry said. She looked at him then, really looked, past his age, past the lines etched into his face by decades of dutiful restraint. That afternoon, they shared lunch beneath the oak tree. Sophie had brought a sandwich, turkey, cheddar, a swipe of honey mustard, wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to Henry without fanfare, but her hand brushed his as she passed it. "A peace offering," she said. "For what war?" She smiled faintly. "The one I wage with myself." The silence between them wasn't awkward. It stretched comfortably, like an old blanket between friends. But somewhere within it lived a question neither dared ask. "What are we doing?" Later that week, Margaret found Henry in the shed, organizing tools that didn't need organizing. She stood in the doorway, arms folded. "You're avoiding me," she said. "I'm organizing the spades." "That's not what I meant." Henry sighed. "I'm just tired." "No," she said sharply. "You're quiet. Distant. I know you, Henry. I know what that means." He turned to face her. "What are you accusing me of?" "Nothing," she said. "Not yet." That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching shadows creep across the yard. The garden was a dark silhouette, its beauty hidden, its secrets intact. The next morning, Sophie arrived early. Her eyes were puffy, her voice raw. "He came back last night," she said, gripping the fence post. "He was drunk. Said I was lucky anyone bothered to love me at all." Henry's fists clenched. "I locked him out," she said. "I think I'm done." Henry led her to the porch. He brewed her tea, while she stared into the garden like it might whisper a solution. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. "I don't mean to drag you into this." "You're not dragging me anywhere," he replied. "I'm here, because I want to be." She looked up, her eyes glassy. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why not?" "Because it's kind. And I'm starting to need kindness more than I should." Henry's throat tightened. "Is that wrong?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But it feels dangerous." That afternoon, they didn't garden. They sat on the porch, speaking in hushed tones about places they'd never visited, people they'd once been. Sophie spoke of Maine summers and her grandmother's kitchen, of reading by candlelight during power outages. Henry spoke of books, of classrooms that smelled like chalk and adolescent angst, of how he missed being looked up to. Sophie tilted her head. "You still deserve to be admired." The words landed heavier than she intended. She bit her lip and stood. "I should go," she said. "The rain's coming." As she walked away, Henry called out, "Sophie." She turned. "Thank you for seeing me." She smiled, truly smiled, teeth and all. "You're hard to miss." That night, Henry couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in lust, but in a gnawing, aching way that filled the hollows inside him. He sat at his desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and began to write. "Dear Sophie, I don't know how to say this aloud, so I'm writing it down. I think about you too often. Not just when you're here, but when you're not. Your voice lingers in the rooms you've never stepped in. Your sadness feels familiar, like my own. And I'm ashamed, because I have a wife, because I'm old enough to know better. But I can't help it. You are a light, and I haven't felt light in years." He folded the letter and tucked it into the pages of an old gardening manual on the bookshelf. He didn't plan to give it to her. Writing it was enough. A confession in the quiet. A truth whispered into the dark. The next morning, Margaret was already in the kitchen, coffee cup in hand. "You're writing again," she said flatly. He hesitated. "Old habits." Margaret stared out the window, her voice brittle. "Old habits are dangerous, Henry. They feel safe until they ruin you." He said nothing. In the garden, a rabbit darted between the hydrangeas, nibbling leaves with fearless delight. Henry watched it disappear into the hedge, his heart hammering. The air had changed. It wasn't the scent of approaching rain or the cool bite of early autumn. It was the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in energy that comes when something sacred has been disturbed. Sophie hadn't shown up that Friday. Henry waited. He busied himself, raking the walkway twice, checking the greenhouse even though she never went in there. He told himself maybe she'd overslept, maybe her car wouldn't start. But by noon, when her soft knock still hadn't come, he sat on the garden bench, hand clutching a thermos she'd once filled for him, and felt foolish. That evening, Margaret stood at the stove, stirring lentil soup with a kind of purposeful calm that only anger could produce. "She's not coming back," she said without turning. Henry looked up. "What do you mean?" She called. "Told me it would be best for everyone if she stopped working here." His breath caught. "She called you?" Margaret finally turned, her eyes tired but steady. "Yes, Henry. Because I'm still your wife." The words hung between them like smoke from a fire neither had extinguished. "I didn't," he began, but stopped himself. He didn't know what he hadn't done anymore. Margaret set the spoon down with a soft clink. "I've watched you drift toward her like a man starved. And I said nothing because I thought maybe it was harmless. But we both know it wasn't." Henry sat down, the chair creaking beneath him. "I never meant to hurt you." "I believe that," she said. "But you still did." They ate in silence. The soup went cold before either of them finished it. That night, sleep came in fragments. Henry's dreams were disjointed images. Sophie walking away down a dirt path, her braid unraveling behind her. The rabbit darting through the hydrangeas. Margaret watching from the porch with unreadable eyes. At dawn, he retrieved the letter from the gardening book. He stared at the envelope, unopened and trembling in his hand like a confession with breath. He drove to Sophie's apartment just outside town, an aging building with rust-stained gutters and uneven steps. Her car wasn't in the lot. Still, he climbed to her door and knocked. No answer. He slid the envelope beneath the door and walked away without looking back. That evening, a knock sounded at his front door. Henry's chest tightened, but it wasn't Sophie. It was a delivery boy holding a small parcel. Henry opened it on the porch. Inside was his envelope, unopened, and a note in Sophie's familiar handwriting on scrap paper.
Don't.
Please, don't undo what's left unbroken. Some part of me will always carry the weight of your kindness. But we both know we weren't meant to exist outside that garden. It was signed only with an initial, S. Henry stood still for a long time. The sky had darkened. A chill wind curled around his collar, lifting the letter slightly before he tucked it into his coat pocket. 2 weeks passed. The garden grew wilder by the day. Weeds began to poke through the flower beds Sophie once tended with surgical care. The roses, untamed, began to tangle over the arbor like long, grasping arms. The rabbit stopped visiting. Margaret moved through the house with a grace that was both deliberate and distant. They shared space but not presence. One morning, she paused beside his chair and placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. "I'm not angry anymore," she said. He turned to her. "Then what are you?" "Empty," she whispered. "And tired of pretending that's enough." She didn't cry. Margaret never cried. Instead, she walked away, leaving Henry with the hollow feeling of a goodbye that didn't need to be said aloud. On the third Sunday of the month, Henry returned to church alone. People greeted him with cautious smiles. He could feel the whispers behind cupped hands. Small towns didn't need facts to build stories. After the service, the pastor approached. A kind man, younger than most, with a patient smile and probing eyes. "How's the garden?" he asked. Henry hesitated, unraveling. The pastor nodded like he understood more than Henry had said. Sometimes growth comes after ruin. It sounded like a sermon. It felt like a warning. That afternoon, Henry stood in the garden, gloves on, shovel in hand. He began pulling weeds slowly, methodically. Not to restore beauty, but to feel something move, to feel anything. Dirt under fingernails, sweat along his neck, penance, perhaps, for a heart too easily tempted. He unearthed the small wooden rabbit Sophie had carved from a tree limb months ago, a joke between them. She'd painted its eyes too large, said it looked like it had secrets.
He had laughed.
Now it just stared. He set it on the bench and returned to work. By evening, the garden had begun to show signs of order. Not the kind Sophie could coax, but a practical neatness. A return to habit. To what could be controlled. Margaret didn't come outside. She hadn't asked about Sophie in days. She moved like a woman rebuilding a life quietly from within. That night, as Henry prepared for bed, he stood at the mirror, staring at his reflection. The lines on his face seemed deeper, his eyes more sunken. He reached for the bathroom light and paused. For the first time in years, he didn't recognize the man looking back. He switched off the light,